So, we're continuing our series on Bible books, and today it's Jonah. Anger. It's all about anger. Did you know that about Jonah? Anger is a powerful emotion and can send us down incredibly terrible paths. I know this personally. I don't know if you do. And the story of Jonah is a story about anger, specifically Jonah's anger. And what sparks his rage? Surprisingly, it's God's compassion. That's what triggers his indignation. This Bible story forces us to ask ourselves whether we have a heart like Jonah's or a heart like God's. So, our key word for this book is compassion. And the key verse is Jonah 4:2. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. And this book takes place sometime around 750 to 725 BC. Now, that verse is lovely, and you would think that Jonah was saying that in praise of God, but he was angry about that. We'll get to that. So the book of Jonah is different from all the other prophetic books that we've been talking about. In this case, rather than focusing on the message of the prophet, we get a story about the prophet. People wonder whether the story of Jonah is real or an allegory, because we all know this story, right? Could a man be swallowed by a great fish? Well, my opinion, if God wants him to be swallowed by a great fish, he will be swallowed by a great fish. God can do anything. We do know that Jonah was indeed a real person because he's mentioned as prophesying to King Jeroboam in the northern kingdom of Israel in 2 Kings 14. So there's a cross-reference there. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today we're talking about Jonah's story. And the first thing that happens is God calls Jonah, and Jonah runs away. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. What kind of prophet is it who hears God's call and runs in the opposite direction? We'll find out more about that later, but here we see that the very idea of going to Nineveh turns Jonah into the exact opposite of a God follower. He doesn't drop everything and go where like he should. He doesn't complain to God or say that I'm not qualified, which we hear a lot of other prophets do. He doesn't even just stay at home, get under the covers, curl up, put his pillow over his head. No, he runs. He finds a ship bound in the opposite direction, and he pays. He pays to get away from God. What happens next is God sends a storm and a fish, and Jonah repents. So then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. The pagan sailors on board this ship, they were just terrified. They called upon their gods. They threw their cargo into the sea. And what's weird is that this is the part where Jonah curls up under the covers. He's below deck, sleeping soundly. He thought he was safe. He thought he was safe from God's demands. Now he could finally relax. But no, the captain woke him up and said, "Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Everyone on board got together and cast lots to determine who was responsible for this terrible storm. That's how weird this storm was. It was strange. They knew that there was somebody responsible. Now, casting lots sounds like a very pagan thing to do, but God honored it, and the lot fell to Jonah. Jonah didn't confess until he had no choice. And then they asked, "Who are you?" And he answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." And this terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" So Jonah told them that he was running away from the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. And naturally, these sailors were appalled, but they did their best to save Jonah, even though he told them that the only way for them to live would be to pick him up and throw him in the sea. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. And then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Jonah's first converts, these poor sailors that he'd put in such grave danger. Now, please note that Jonah here was not being noble by sacrificing himself. The truth is that he was still running away from God. Jonah would rather die than go to Nineveh and preach. He proved it. "Throw me overboard, please." And immediately, the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Well, that's fairly casually stated. There's no breaking news announcement. There's no drama or hysteria here. Just the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. Okay, then. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, this is why I have trouble believing the Bible. Swallowed by a fish, even by a whale, that's crazy talk, right? Personally, I look at it differently. There's really, in this story, there's no need for a fish. If you're telling a lie and want it to be believed, wouldn't you try to make it believable? If it weren't true, why make it up? To my way of thinking, God can rescue Jonah any way he wants. He could pick him up and drop him on dry land. But he was pleased to provide a huge fish. And I think God is plenty powerful enough to do this. And continuing to speculate, the fish turned out to be a great idea. God's full of great ideas. Apparently, Jonah needed 3 days and 3 nights to consider things more fully. If God had rescued him by sending him immediately to shore, Jonah would have had other concerns, like how to find food, how to get back home, how to run away again, and on and on and on. But if you're stuck in the belly of a fish, you have time to meditate, to cogitate, to ruminate, to ponder. And that's what Jonah did. Remember how everyone else on that boat prayed to their God, but Jonah didn't? After 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a fish, Jonah prayed a beautiful, beautiful prayer. It's a poem, in fact. And if you have 3 days to ponder things, maybe you'll find out that you're a poet too. Jonah finally repented, and here's his prayer. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. To the earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord." And this poem makes me see what God sees in Jonah. He may be a kind of an angry, petty twerp, but he does have a brilliant way with words. So God delivered him. And then Jonah preached. Immediately the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Well, that's an undignified way to get to shore, but God delivered Jonah after he repented. And God said to Jonah, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you." And here's the message he proclaimed: 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. Well, that's brief, concise, minimal. And here's what happened. The Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued in Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds of flocks, taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink, but let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. Well, that's some effective preaching. All of them, including the king, completely repented. And I have a little theory about why Jonah's message might have hit home. I wonder, did anybody see Jonah get spit out onto land from a big fish? If so, that story would have spread pretty rapidly, don't you think? And it might have even reached Nineveh. And that might help explain the reception that the city gave him, even though all he said was, 40 days from now, you're gone. I remember a youth pastor of mine preaching on this when I was a kid, and he said Jonah entered Nineveh looking horrible. He was bleached white from the fish's gastric juices, and he had seaweed wrapped around his head. That was from his prayer. And now, I think that by the time he hit Nineveh, the seaweed would have fallen off. But still, he could have looked pretty terrible, and nobody doubted who he was and what had happened to him, and that his God was very, very powerful. That's just my theory, though. God did show mercy, and Jonah regretted that he did the preaching at all. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. God showed mercy to the Ninevites. And notice, it's not because they took up Judaism. They didn't start making sacrifices. It was because they had turned from their evil ways. And this is the kind of thing Paul in the New Testament and the writer of Hebrews, that's what they were talking about when they say we are saved by faith, not by following the law. And it's proved here in the Old Testament with the Ninevites. The law is a great thing, but it is not the means of salvation. That can only be accomplished by faith. Paul says in Romans, the promise to Abraham comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only those who are of the law, but also to those who have the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all. So we serve a merciful God who wants all to come to him, and he delights in relenting from judgment. Jonah did not find this delightful. To Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." Yes, Jonah again is angry enough to die. And this isn't an exaggeration. We know he means it. He proved it before. Throw me into the sea, please. I have to ask, is there someone that you never want to see in heaven? Someone you know? A kid who bullied you in the 7th grade? A teacher who bullied you in the 7th grade? Someone you never even met? Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot, Vladimir Putin. Would it make you angry enough to die? Because you do have that choice. If you hate your enemy so much that you'd rather die than see them in heaven, you can choose hell. You can choose complete and utter separation from God, as well as that person whom you hope to never meet in heaven. Do you have God's heart of mercy toward the worst of the worst, or do you have a heart of anger like Jonah? Think about it. How would we manage? How would any of us manage before God if he were as angry and unrelenting as we are? Here's what Jesus says. But love your enemies. Do good to them. Lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. God gave an unjust city a chance to repent, and Jonah was enraged by this injustice of God's compassion. We all think we know better than God who ought to be in his kingdom, but we are all wrong, and God is right. God knows that none of us belong in heaven. He has opened it up to anyone who has faith in him, who repents, who changes their evil ways. God then teaches Jonah a lesson about grace, while Jonah continues to stay angry. The Lord replied, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. So God asks Jonah this question, is it right for you to be angry? And I think Jonah knows the correct answer. The answer to that question. He can probably at least guess, but he doesn't answer. Jonah is a stubborn one. He apparently gave God the silent treatment. In the meantime, he went outside the city to watch. He knows that his message came from God. In 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. He was hoping that the Ninevites would mess up and God would send the fire and the brimstone. So he waited and watched. Then the Lord provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. Here's a surprise. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." But God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" "It is," he said, "and I am so angry I wish I were dead." So while he waited, God sent an unasked for and unearned, undeserved blessing to Jonah, a big shady plant, just like he sent that great fish to save him. We here in the tropics know the difference between sitting in the sun and sitting in the shade. It's not that big a deal in Wisconsin, where I grew up, but here it can make a big difference. And the plant made Jonah happy, or at least happier. Then God sent a worm to destroy the plant. And then he sent a strong, scorching wind. I also have lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and have stood outside in July in 115-degree heat, and that wind made it feel like I was standing in a hairdryer. It's not pleasant. Jonah, for at least the third time here, is angry enough to want to die. He felt like he should have that shelter, that shady plant, but he'd had nothing to do with it. Whether it grew or it died, it was all God's doing. But the Lord said, "You've been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and it died overnight. Should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals?" Well, Jonah was miserable over the loss of a 24-hour plant that he'd had nothing to do with. He was willing to watch thousands of people created in God's image die and go to hell. And though Jonah liked it when God cared for him and provided him with shade from the heat, when God wanted to care for sinners, including young children, Jonah was enraged. God's prophet may have had God's words, but he did not have God's heart. So Jonah's story shows us that God's mercy extends to all people. Even the wicked Ninevites, hated Ninevites, were not beyond his saving power. And fortunately for us, Jonah also was not beyond God's saving power. After finally obeying and preaching in Nineveh, Jonah became angry at God for having compassion on that evil city. Then God used a plant and a worm to show Jonah the evil in his own heart. God did feel sorry for Nineveh, but he felt sorry for Jonah too. Jonah walked with God while dragging his feet. He was offered transformation, but he didn't let God's perspective permeate his life. How often are we like Jonah? Fortunately, God keeps working on us. He's not satisfied until he transforms us. So let's think about this during the week. Do we have a heart like Jonah's, full of anger and bitterness, or a heart like God's, full of mercy and love? Amen.